The night Moses Roper decided to run, he looked at his hands, scarred, calloused, but still his own, and made a promise to himself that would carry him through 500 miles of terror, hope, and transformation. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now, because this story of courage, intelligence, and unbreakable will is one you need to hear from beginning to end. The year was 1834, and Moses stood in the darkness behind the Cotton Gin in Caswell County, North Carolina, calculating his chances. He was 20 years old, though he looked older, the kind of aging that comes not from time, but from surviving what should have broken a person. His master, Mr. Gooch, was known throughout the county as particularly cruel, a man who saw human beings as nothing more than tools to be used until they broke. Moses had been sold 5 times in his young life, passed from hand to hand like property, each transaction stripping away another layer of the boy he had been, forcing him to become the man he needed to be to survive. But tonight, something had shifted inside him. Perhaps it was the conversation he'd overheard between 2 white men discussing the sale of his mother to a plantation in Alabama, a place so far south, it might as well have been the end of the earth. Perhaps it was the fresh scars on his back from last week's whipping, administered because he had paused for water during the hottest part of the day, or perhaps it was simply that he had reached the point where the fear of running was finally smaller than the fear of staying. Freedom, he whispered to himself, testing the word on his tongue like a prayer. 500 miles north, Pennsylvania, free soil. He had been planning this for months, gathering information the way other men gathered crops, carefully, methodically, storing each piece of knowledge like seeds for a future harvest. He knew which roads the patrollers traveled and when. He knew which rivers could be forded and which required swimming. He knew that moss grew on the north side of trees, that the North Star held steady while other stars wheeled around it, that dogs could be thrown off a scent by walking through water or rubbing oneself with onions. What Moses didn't know then was that this journey would test every ounce of intelligence, courage, and faith he possessed, and that the man who arrived in Pennsylvania would be forever changed by the 500 miles that lay between bondage and freedom. Moses had learned early that survival required more than physical strength. It required the ability to read people, to understand what they wanted to see, and give them that image while hiding your true self deep inside where they couldn't reach it. Around Mr. Gooch, he had learned to move slowly, to keep his eyes down, to speak only when spoken to present the image of a man too simple to cause trouble. But inside, his mind was always working, always observing, always learning. He had learned to read by watching the master's children at their lessons, memorizing the shapes of letters, the sounds they made, the way they combined to form words. He had practiced in secret, scratching letters in the dirt with a stick and then smoothing them away before anyone could see. Reading was forbidden, a crime punishable by brutal whipping or worse, but Moses understood that knowledge was power, and he needed every advantage he could gather. He had learned geography by listening to conversations, by studying the maps he glimpsed in the master's house when he was sent to deliver messages, by asking careful questions of the few free black people he encountered who had traveled. He knew that Pennsylvania was north, that it was perhaps 500 miles away, that it was a place where slavery was illegal, where a black man could walk free without papers, without a master, without fear of being snatched back into bondage. But he also knew that between North Carolina and Pennsylvania lay a gauntlet of dangers that had claimed countless others who had tried to run. There were the patrollers, poor white men paid to hunt runaways, men who saw capturing escaped slaves as sport and profit combined. There were the dogs, trained to track human scent, vicious animals that could tear a man apart. There were the rivers to cross, the mountains to climb, the endless miles of hostile territory where any white person might demand to see papers he didn't have, might raise an alarm that would bring the patrollers running. And there was hunger, exhaustion, Exposure to the elements, the constant fear that gnawed at the edges of consciousness, making sleep nearly impossible, turning every sound into a potential threat. Moses knew all of this, had heard the stories of those who had tried and failed, who had been brought back broken and made examples of. Their suffering meant to discourage others from attempting the same journey, but he also knew that staying meant a slow death of the spirit, a gradual erosion of everything that made him human. He had watched it happen to others, seen the light fade from their eyes, seen them become the things their masters claimed they were, seen them give up the fight and accept their fate. Moses refused to let that happen to him. He would run, and he would either reach freedom or die trying. Either outcome was better than remaining in bondage. The night he chose for his escape was moonless, the darkness so complete it felt like a physical presence. He had hidden supplies over the previous weeks, a small knife stolen from the kitchen, a piece of flint for starting fires, a tin cup, a bit of cornmeal wrapped in cloth, a tattered blanket. It wasn't much, but it was all he could manage without arousing suspicion. He wore his sturdiest clothes and the boots he had carefully repaired, knowing that his feet would be his most important asset in the journey ahead. At midnight, when the overseer had made his final rounds and the other enslaved people were asleep in their quarters, Moses slipped away. He moved like a shadow, using every bit of cover, freezing at the slightest sound, his heart pounding so hard he was certain someone would hear it. The first mile was the most dangerous, still on the plantation, still within easy reach of those who would stop him. But he made it to the edge of the property without raising an alarm. And then he was in the woods, moving north by the stars, beginning the longest journey of his life. The first night, he covered perhaps 10 miles, moving as fast as he dared through unfamiliar terrain. He walked in streams when he could, knowing it would make him harder to track. He avoided roads, staying in the forest, accepting the slower pace in exchange for greater safety. When dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, he found a dense thicket and crawled into its center, pulling the blanket over himself, trying to become invisible. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, every bird call, every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent adrenaline surging through his body. He lay there, exhausted but too terrified to rest, listening for the sound of dogs, of men's voices, of pursuit. But the day passed quietly, and when darkness fell again, he emerged from his hiding place, ate a handful of the cornmeal mixed with water from a stream, and continued north. This became his pattern. Walking through the night, hiding during the day, covering as much ground as he could while fighting exhaustion, hunger, and the constant fear of capture. He rationed his meager supplies carefully, knowing they had to last, supplementing them when he could with berries, with roots he recognized as edible, with water from streams and springs. On the third night, he heard dogs in the distance. The sound froze him in his tracks, terror flooding his body. They were hunting someone. Perhaps him, perhaps another runaway. He didn't wait to find out. He found a stream and walked in it for miles, the cold water numbing his feet, his legs, but hopefully washing away his scent. He rubbed himself with wild onions he found growing near the bank. A trick he had heard could confuse the dogs. And he prayed. Not to the God the white preacher spoke of, the God who supposedly ordained slavery and commanded servants to obey their masters, but to the God his mother had whispered about, the God of Moses in Egypt, the God who freed the captives and led them to the promised land. The dogs' barking faded into the distance, and Moses allowed himself to hope that they had been hunting someone else, or that his precautions had worked. He climbed out of the stream and continued walking, his wet clothes chilling him in the night air, but alive, still free, still moving north. By the end of the first week, Moses had covered perhaps 70 miles. His feet were blistered and bleeding, his body was gaunt from lack of food, and exhaustion made every step an act of will. But he was still free, still moving, still holding on to the dream of Pennsylvania. He had crossed into Virginia, though he had no way of knowing exactly where he was. The landscape had changed. More mountains, denser forests, fewer plantations. This was both good and bad. Fewer people meant fewer chances of being spotted, but it also meant fewer opportunities to find food. He came upon a small settlement of free black people living in a hidden hollow in the mountains. They were cautious at first, suspicious of this stranger who appeared out of the darkness. But when Moses explained his situation, they took him in. They fed him, let him rest for a day, gave him better directions north, and sent him on his way with a small sack of food and a warning about the patrollers who worked the roads ahead. "You got intelligence in your eyes," the old woman who led the community told him. "You got the look of someone who's going to make it. But don't let confidence make you careless. The road ahead is long and full of dangers. Trust your instincts. Trust God. And remember, freedom is worth whatever it costs." Her words stayed with him as he continued his journey. He thought about them during the long, lonely nights of walking, during the terrifying days of hiding, during the moments when exhaustion and hunger made him question whether he could go on. Freedom is worth whatever it costs. He repeated it like a mantra, letting it drive him forward when his body wanted to collapse, when his mind wanted to give up, when the enormity of what he was attempting threatened to overwhelm him. The second week brought new challenges. He had to cross a major river, and he couldn't swim well. He spent 2 days walking along the bank, looking for a place to ford, finally finding a spot where the water was shallow enough to wade across. The current was strong, and he nearly lost his footing several times, but he made it to the other side, his supplies soaked but intact. He encountered a white farmer working alone in a field and had to make a split-second decision, hide or bluff. He chose to bluff, walking boldly past, nodding respectfully, presenting the image of a slave on an errand for his master. The farmer barely looked at him, and Moses continued on, his heart racing, knowing how close he had come to disaster. He found an abandoned cabin and spent a day resting there, his body demanding recovery. He used the time to tend to his feet, wrapping them in strips torn from his blanket, trying to protect the raw, bleeding skin. He ate the last of his food, and knew he would have to find more soon, or start to weaken seriously. That night, he raided a vegetable garden, taking just enough to sustain him, a few potatoes, some carrots, an onion. He felt guilty about the theft, knowing that some family would wake to find their food missing, but survival overrode guilt. He was not a thief by nature, but slavery had made him one, had forced him to take what he needed because nothing was freely given. By the third week, Moses had crossed into Maryland. He knew this because he had reached the Potomac River, the border between Virginia and Maryland, and had managed to cross it by finding a ferry and hiding among the cargo. He was perhaps 300 miles from where he had started, which meant he still had 200 miles to go. The journey was taking longer than he had hoped, but he was still alive, still free, still moving north. Maryland was more dangerous than Virginia. There were more people, more towns, more opportunities to be spotted and questioned. Moses had to be more careful, had to move more slowly, had to plan each day's route with meticulous attention to avoiding detection. He traveled mostly at night, as he had been doing. But now he had to navigate around towns and farms, around roads and settlements, finding paths through the wilderness that kept him hidden. He met another runaway during this time, a young man named Samuel, who had escaped from a plantation near Baltimore and was also heading north. They traveled together for 3 days, sharing food, sharing the watch during the day, sharing the burden of fear and hope. Samuel was younger than Moses, perhaps 17, and he looked to Moses for guidance, for leadership, for the confidence that they would make it. But on the third night, they were nearly caught by patrollers. They heard the dogs and the men's voices and ran, splitting up to confuse the pursuit. Moses made it to safety, hiding in a swamp for 2 days, but he never saw Samuel again. He didn't know if the young man had been captured or had simply taken a different route. But the loss haunted him. He had felt responsible for Samuel, had tried to keep him safe, and now he was alone again, carrying the weight of not knowing what had happened. The fourth week brought Moses to the border of Pennsylvania. He was close now, so close he could almost taste it. But this was also the most dangerous part of the journey. The border region was heavily patrolled, with men who made their living catching runaways and returning them for the reward money. Moses had to be more careful than ever, had to use every bit of intelligence and cunning he possessed. He waited for 3 days, observing the patterns of the patrols, learning their schedules, finding the gaps in their coverage. And then, on a moonless night, he made his move. He crossed into Pennsylvania, walking through a forest, following a stream, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going, even though he was navigating by instinct and hope as much as by knowledge. When dawn came, he was on free soil. He had made it. 500 miles, 4 weeks of constant danger, countless close calls, and he had made it. Moses Roper was free. He collapsed under a tree and wept, great heaving sobs that came from the deepest part of his soul. He wept for the years of bondage, for the suffering he had endured, for his mother who was still enslaved, for Samuel and all the others who hadn't made it. He wept for the boy he had been and the man he had become. And he wept with joy, with relief, with the overwhelming realization that he had done what so many said was impossible. But even as he wept, he knew that his journey was not over. Being in Pennsylvania did not guarantee safety. There were still slave catchers who operated in free states, still people who would return him to bondage for the reward money. He needed to find the people who helped runaways, the network that would protect him, help him establish a new life, give him the tools to truly be free. He made his way to Philadelphia, traveling more openly now but still cautiously. In the city, he found the offices of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, and there he met people who welcomed him, who celebrated his courage, who helped him begin the process of building a new life. They gave him food, clothing, a place to stay. They helped him find work. They taught him to read and write more fluently, to speak with confidence, to navigate this new world of freedom. Moses discovered that he had a gift for telling his story, for making people understand what slavery truly was, for conveying the humanity of those still in bondage. He began speaking at anti-slavery meetings, sharing his experiences, using his intelligence and eloquence to advocate for those who could not speak for themselves. His story inspired others, gave hope to those still enslaved, and opened the eyes of those who had never truly understood the horror of the institution. He wrote a book, a narrative of the adventures and escape of Moses Roper from American slavery. Published in 1837, just 3 years after his escape. It became one of the most widely read slave narratives of its time, translated into multiple languages, distributed throughout America and Europe. In it, he detailed not just his escape, but his entire life in slavery. The cruelty he had witnessed and experienced, the strength and intelligence of the enslaved people he had known, the moral bankruptcy of the system that claimed to be ordained by God. Moses traveled to England, where he continued his education, where he spoke to crowds about slavery, where he raised money for the abolitionist cause. He married, had children, built a life that would have been impossible in the land of his birth. But he never forgot where he came from, never forgot those still in bondage, never stopped working for their freedom. Years later, when he was an old man, Moses would sit with his grandchildren and tell them about the 500 miles. He would describe the fear, the hunger, the exhaustion, but also the determination, the hope, the absolute refusal to accept bondage as his fate. He would tell them that freedom was not given, but taken, not a gift, but a right, not something to be grateful for, but something to be claimed and defended. I walked 500 miles, he would say, but the journey was longer than that. It was a journey from seeing myself as property to knowing myself as a human being. It was a journey from accepting what others said I was to defining myself. It was a journey from bondage to freedom, yes, but also from despair to hope, from powerlessness to agency, from being acted upon to acting for myself. He would tell them about the people who had helped him along the way, the free black community in the mountains, the strangers who had looked the other way when they could have raised an alarm, the abolitionists who had welcomed him and supported him. He would tell them that freedom was not an individual achievement, but a collective one, that he had made it because others had paved the way, had taken risks, had believed in the possibility of a different world. And he would tell them about the responsibility that came with freedom, the obligation to use his liberty to work for the liberation of others, to speak for those who could not speak, to remember those who had not made it, to honor the struggle by continuing it until every person was free. Moses Roper lived to see the end of slavery in America, lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation, lived to know that the institution that had claimed him as property had been destroyed. But he also lived to see the rise of new forms of oppression, new ways of denying black people their full humanity, new systems designed to maintain white supremacy even without the legal framework of slavery. He understood that the fight for freedom was not a single battle, but a long war, that liberation was not a destination, but a process, that each generation would have to take up the struggle in its own way. And he took comfort in knowing that he had played his part, that his 500 miles had mattered, that his story had inspired others, that his life had been a testament to the indomitable human spirit. When Moses Roper died in 1891 at the age of 77, he was buried in a free land, surrounded by family, mourned by a community that honored his courage and celebrated his life. His gravestone bore a simple inscription: "He walked to freedom." But those 4 words contained multitudes. They spoke of courage and determination, of intelligence and strategy, of faith and hope, of the refusal to accept bondage as fate, of the insistence on claiming one's humanity even when the entire world denied it. The story of Moses Roper is not just a historical curiosity, not just an interesting tale from the past. It is a reminder of what human beings are capable of when pushed to the edge, when faced with the choice between accepting oppression and risking everything for freedom. It is a testament to the power of the human spirit, to the intelligence and courage of people who were told they were less than human, but who proved, through their actions, that they were fully, completely, magnificently human. Moses walked 500 miles, but his journey echoes through the generations. Every person who has fought for freedom, who has refused to accept injustice, who has risked everything for the chance to live with dignity, they are walking those 500 miles with him. Every person who has used their intelligence to survive impossible circumstances, who has found creative ways to resist oppression, who has maintained their humanity in the face of dehumanization, they are carrying forward his legacy. The 500 miles Moses Roper walked were not just a physical journey from North Carolina to Pennsylvania. They were a spiritual journey from bondage to liberation, a psychological journey from seeing himself through his oppressor's eyes to seeing himself through his own eyes, a moral journey from accepting the world as it was to insisting on the world as it should be. And that journey continues in every person who refuses to accept injustice, who fights for freedom, who insists on their full humanity. We honor Moses Roper not by feeling sorry for what he endured, but by celebrating what he achieved. We honor him not by focusing on his suffering, but by recognizing his strength. We honor him not by seeing him as a victim, but by acknowledging him as a hero. Not because he was superhuman, but because he was fully human, and because he refused to let anyone take that humanity away from him. The 500 miles are still being walked. Every day, people around the world are making their own journeys toward freedom, are fighting their own battles against oppression, are refusing to accept the limitations others try to place on them. They walk in Moses Roper's footsteps, drawing strength from his example, inspired by his courage, encouraged by his success. And so we remember Moses Roper not as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the present and future. We remember that freedom is not free, that it must be fought for, that it requires courage and intelligence and determination and faith. We remember that every person has within them the capacity for extraordinary courage, that every human being deserves to live in freedom and dignity, that no system of oppression can ultimately defeat the human spirit. Moses Roper walked 500 miles to freedom, and in doing so, he lit a path that others would follow, a path that leads from bondage to liberation, from despair to hope, from oppression to justice. His journey reminds us that the arc of history does not bend toward justice on its own. It bends because people like Moses Roper grab hold of it and pull with all their strength, refusing to let go, insisting that a better world is possible, and walking 500 miles to prove it. If this story has moved you, if Moses Roper's courage has inspired you, if you believe that stories like this need to be told and remembered and celebrated, then subscribe to this channel right now. Share this story with everyone you know. Let Moses Roper's 500 miles echo through time, reminding us all of what human beings are capable of when they refuse to accept bondage, when they insist on their freedom, when they walk toward liberation no matter how long the journey, no matter how dangerous the path, no matter what stands in their way. Subscribe, share, and keep walking toward freedom.